Is this turned on? Welcome everybody to Rick Fry in Real Time. My guest today, and I'm really excited to have him, is Larry Eiss from West Virginia. I see Larry probably once a year at the Network 220 conference in Dallas or wherever they have it. And actually in those few encounters, I think we've gotten to be pretty good friends.
I would say so.
There's not a lot about you on your Facebook page, so I don't have much information on your history or what you do or when you do it. It does say you like to encourage believers.
Right. Right.
Yep.
Yeah, it can be risky posting a lot of personal details, I think, on social media, especially when you're doing things out in front of people like we are. So.
Yeah. So I guess we'll just jump right into this. You posted an article, or did you write this, or
right?
However have you acquired it? You posted it on the changes in Romans 8:1, and what caught your attention about that?
Well, so the question of the difference came up due to a post that I made in which an interpretation of the variant text was proposed.
Yes.
And I wanted to address that in greater detail. And the way I chose to do it was to point out that not all the manuscripts say these words that are existing in Romans 8:1.
Right.
And
I called this. I think I'm gonna title this podcast. There's therefore no condemnation with conditions, because it seems to me. Do you? I didn't write down the verse. Romans 8:1.
Yeah, let me read it. Here's what the King James has. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Now let me read you that from the New American Standard. Therefore there is now no condemnation at all for those who are in Christ Jesus. Period.
Yeah. So the other part kind of makes it conditional. If you're not walking in the right way, it right. implies that you're condemned.
Well, can get that idea. Yeah. And which is why, I wanted to address it, because, if they talk about that as being the correct reading, then they need to understand that, the text isn't trying to communicate conditionality, but there is a risk there for sure.
Yes, there is, because I don't always walk in the Spirit. Sometimes I walk in my flesh.
No, not you. Come on, buddy.
Well, Andrew Farley says walking in our Spirit is our default.
Right.
Walking in the Spirit is our default. So you have to choose to walk in the flesh.
I agree.
So these verses were added. At what time in history do you think they were added?
This phrase was added. It looks, well, so there are a couple of different theories on this, but the most prominent is expressed in very well, I think, in the translator notes of the NET Bible, the New English Translation, which is an interesting translation of the Bible, because one of the great things they do is they include about 60,000 translator and study notes in there. And the translator notes are gold for this kind of thing. So what they have to say about it is that the earliest and best witnesses of the Alexandrian and the Western texts, as well as a few others, which they list, have N-E-T? No additional words. NET.
NET translation. Okay.
Yeah. Have no additional words for verse 1. And in their view, and the view of, I would say, the majority of Bible scholars and those who work at translation, this is probably the majority view. that later scribes added these words, who walk not according to the flesh, and then again a second amendation was made to add, but who do walk according to the Spirit. Um, and the argument here is that both the external evidence and the internal evidence are compelling for the shorter reading without that phrase in there at all. And then the thing I don't like about this interpretation is that they kind of impugn the motives of the scribes, and I'm not sure we're capable of doing that. They say the scribes were evidently motivated to add the qualifications to insulate Paul's gospel from charges that it was characterized by too much grace.
I read that, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't particularly see it that way, and I can't find my source on this, but the way I first understood this, I was shown an image of one of the manuscripts that does not contain this change. And in that manuscript, if you're reading along in Romans 1, or Romans 8:1, you read to a certain point in the line, and if your eye drops to the next line, you get this phrase from Romans 4, or 8:4. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So you get this phrase from Romans 8:4. Now, if we go and look at Romans 8:4 in the King James, we see that it says that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us. And then here is the phrase, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. It's the exact wording that was placed into 8:1. So the way I first understood this, and the way I kind of lean toward now, is that in reading that manuscript, the way the lines laid out in the manuscript, it would have been easy for the scribe to just drop a line, read that phrase and copy it along, and then on the very next, when their eyes went back to the side of the page, read the correct line, which was picking up with later verses and included verse 4, and there's that text again. So it's some kind of error like that. Some say it was added, to kind of make sure that people didn't call Paul, too gracie, but which we know nothing of that. But
Yeah.
but I don't know if that was it or not. But whatever. There are a lot of errors like that,
Yeah.
and most of them have no effect at all. But
no. And you recommended a book, Why I Trust the Bible.
Right. Yeah.
By, what was his name? Muntz? Oh, that's it. Yes.
Bill Mounts. William
Bill
Mounts.
Mounts.
Yep. I guess this is backward in the video, but
no, it's not. It shows right. It showed right.
Okay, good.
He talks about these variants, and
Yeah.
something like 400,000 variants in all of the manuscripts.
Yeah.
And he said none of them influence the truth about who Christ is, who God the Father is, and who
Correct.
Christ did or what he did. They're just people adding clarity. I can't imagine.
Sometimes.
I can't imagine the task of taking Greek and translating into English, because if you do it word for word, it doesn't make any sense to us.
Right,
so
correct.
He says they have to learn the word, learn the context, and then make it match to how we think in English. Which
that's true.
Can you imagine that?
That's what translation really is. Anytime
Yes.
you do translation. So I was, just to give you an example from real life, I was in Brazil one time making a presentation. Now, I don't speak Portuguese, so I had a translator. And I told a joke, kind of. I used an idiom from the United States.
Right.
That was kind of a humorous twist, which is not a smart thing to do when you're speaking internationally. But my translator was so good that he was able to convert that into something that made sense in Brazil, and the audience laughed. I mean, that's translation.
That's translation.
But he didn't say the same thing as me at all.
Okay. Yeah. And
in terms of literal words, he communicated the thought. Yeah.
The thought. Yeah. Are you saying that these two phrases, by walking in the Spirit or in the flesh, were two different events added at two different times?
That's the argument that most of the scholars make. Yes, I don't see it that way because I look at verse 4 and I just can't get over the fact that the wording there is exactly identical to
Mm,
this phrase. So to
okay.
me, it's one thing. That's my personal view, but I am not qualified to hold that
Oh,
view with
nor
any
am I.
kind of security. Um,
Yeah.
but so all the scholars kind of go the other way. They say, yeah, they think it was two emendations. Now, another thing to consider here is that um, when they divide this into two pieces, they have evidence to support why they're doing that. In other words, they can find manuscripts that I have no access to that show
Exactly.
that in one case it had the shorter one and then the longer one was added. So there are two emendations. So I'm
Right.
sure they have solid reasons for that thinking.
Yeah. Um, well, and the next question we sort of already addressed is that this does this addition in your mind um, make no condemnation conditional? And you already sort of addressed that.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it sounds like you have to do this in order to get that freedom from
Well,
condemnation.
right. Well, let me put it to you this way, Rick. I mean, before I understood the pure gospel, that's exactly how I read it. And so I
Exactly. Yeah,
kept
me
thinking,
too.
well, I keep walking according to the flesh, so I guess there's still condemnation for me. And
Yeah.
I grew up in a tradition where they taught that you could lose your salvation. So that made perfect sense, right? When you
Yeah.
read Romans 8:1 in that way, and you have the background of thinking that, you could lose your salvation, then you just take it for what it says. So I always did that. Um, I don't do that any longer. I don't agree that at first, I don't think those words belong there. And then second, even if they did, I don't think they make it conditional.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a denomination where you wouldn't lose your salvation, but you could damage your relationship to God, and
Sure. Yeah.
that while you were in sin, God wouldn't hear your prayers or acknowledge your existence. But and obviously, I don't believe that anymore.
Well, and for the argument being strong that this is not conditional is it says that if the condition is true, if it is conditional, it says who do not walk according to the flesh. Well, none of
Yeah,
us can say we never walk according to the flesh, so
none of us.
we're all condemned.
Yeah,
So it
yeah,
can't mean that. It just doesn't fit with the rest of the gospel, the rest of
right,
scripture.
right, right. Let's see. Is the statement the scribes were evidently motivated to add such qualifications to insulate Paul's gospel from um, charges that it was characterized too much grace? That's kind of the same argument we're having today about the
Hmm.
grace message. Is that you're
Right,
saying that I can do whatever I want to, and it doesn't matter.
right, right.
Behavior does matter,
Yes, it
but
does.
it doesn't affect your relationship to God.
Correct.
Yep.
Nor does
But
it nor
Paul,
does it negate his promises.
no, no.
Yeah, so I again, that's one of the reasons why I'm really not a fan of what most of the scholars say on this because
Yeah.
I don't like impugning their motives in that way. Although I have to say, there's plenty of evidence in other kinds of changes that we've seen, that the translators see, um, that there was some motive in some of these. We so let me just say this. So we have. I'm just going to pull up another book here. This is
Okay.
not one anybody wants to read. This is a kind of a seminary tome, but I wanted to pull it up because it has in it a list that I think will be interesting. So there are about 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and there are about 20,000 versional manuscripts, which means these are handwritten portions of the New Testament in like this one was written in Latin, or this one was written in some other language, and or this one was written in Greek, but it was done in a little small community area type of thing. Somebody was making copies, those kinds of things. And
Yeah.
then there are more than 1 million quotations by patristic writers. These are, the guys that were living in the first 200 or 300 or 400 years after Christ. The amount of support that we have for the New Testament is staggering, frankly. If you look at any other ancient Greek author, they don't even have a thousandth of that much. so
Wow.
so we have a lot of different things to go on. So we can see a lot broader context than perhaps is evident to most people. In addition to that, you probably know that uh, in the 1930s, there were some discoveries of some additional text, things like the Qumran scrolls that we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, and
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. So over time, since the beginning, there have been a few discoveries like this, which have added a great deal to our understanding. And some of those discoveries were actually older texts than the ones we had been using. So when we look at things like what Eusebius used when he translated the King James, uh, those texts were the best at the time that he had, but they are newer. Their source is newer than a lot of stuff that's been, discovered since. So there's a lot of work that goes into figuring out what the original text actually said, but the process of doing that is pretty scientific and pretty well defined. They call it, unfortunately, textual criticism. I don't like that
Mm-hmm.
because it has a
Well,
negative
yeah,
connotation right off
it
the
sort
bat.
of does.
Like,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
you're taking the original text and trying to criticize it. No, 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 no. What we're doing is we're
That's not
taking
what.
these myriad manuscripts and holding their feet to the fire, as it were, and making them prove their validity. And we do that by
Exactly.
comparison and all this. So there's a lot of work that goes into all that. What comes out of it is something that we call the critical text, which is it's a compilation of the New Testament in Greek uh, from what we have determined are the best and oldest manuscripts. And that is what translators today use to write new translations.
Mm. Can you talk a little bit about the Alexandrian, Western,
Yeah.
and Byzantine
These are called text types.
text
And
types?
what that
Okay.
means is that they all came from sort of the relatively same stream of writing. In other words, the Alexandrian texts originated in Alexandria, Egypt, and those areas.
Sure.
The Western text, has its origin, and the Byzantine text is one that came more out of, the Byzantine Empire, right? And so there were tons and tons of copies of that. That's the primary source uh, for translations like King James, New King James, even ESV, um,
Mm-hmm.
which is a more modern, translation, uh, and it is the text from which uh, some of these older translations came, which then was so common that and was the best known at the time that it was called the received text or textus receptus.
Mm-hmm.
And so this became sort of the majority of what people were using. Then, as the Alexandrian texts were discovered, uh, they there were two branches from that, and you can go back and look at them. But what we find is that those texts can trace their origin pretty well to about the 200s, where the Byzantine text goes back only to about the 400s.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, they are significantly older, and they are significantly more consistent across the variations. And what I mean by that is that in the Byzantine text, it was copied lots and lots of times by lots and lots of people. So there are a lot of different variants, and they have some significant differences. And so to pull that together into something cohesive was a little more work, and you can have a little bit less certainty. With the Alexandrian texts, we find that there are fewer of those kinds of differences because there were fewer streams of copying and that kind of thing. The Western text is incorporated kind of because it it has its regional significance. And so that helps us to make sure that when we have a reading in the Alexandrian and a reading in the Byzantine that the Western agrees with, then we're going to say, oh, well, this was the common reading in these three areas of the world. It's likely that that comes from an original source. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
it's just one more of the pieces of the puzzle that get put together to determine what the original text said.